So that's okay. I'll do it after. So when it comes to the light settings, if you go into the point lights settings here, I don't know why these guys are different too. But yeah, sorry. But as you toggle through these, you can get into the, for example, the directional light, which you'll see has an entirely different kind of set of possibilities and kind of opportunities implemented with it. I found that when it comes to the shadow density, you can apply a stronger shadow that's cast down in a very kind of particular direction. When it comes to the shadow itself, as you cast the shadow, if you go into the specular as well as the volume, you can create something that isn't quite so stark and unrealistic. You can kind of create a shadow that, like the light, has a decay rate and will blur as the edges continue. Yeah, it'd be easier to show if I could render this guy out. Jay, do you mind if we bring up your laptop? Yeah, it's a little bit. Maybe. Actually, that would be better. I can just render region. So in the meantime, I've turned the intensity of that directional light way up, and as you can see, it starts to create kind of the reflections off of the surface underneath. The blend surface that I chose before is quite reflective, and unfortunately, that kind of creates a mirrored effect on the bottom. So I might go in and just bring in the default. All right, let's just try that. Okay. Do you know what the default material on this guy? I can't seem to find him.
I saw one material, yeah.
And then
Arnold, shader, and Arnold shader. Standard, AI standard.
AI standard? There he is. Okay, we're back in business now. Sorry, guys. So this is brutal. There we go. I'll just go like that. So you can see that there's a very stark shadow that's being cast back there. If you go through the light settings, you can start to play around and soften that that shadow. So as you go in, as you select the light itself and you go into Arnold, you can start to play with the density of the shadow, as well as the volume samples and the diffuse, and that will reduce kind of the stark contrast of the shadows. And so that's kind of like the basic rundown of some of the lights. So I'll take you through also the directional light, or the spotlight, which is this guy. If you look in the top corner here, it looks like the flashlight. So if you select on that, you end up with a cone. And what's so interesting about this guy here is not only do you play with the intensity, but you can also play with the cone angle. So you can spread the angle of the light and how it's cast onto the object itself. Yeah. As well as you can manipulate the light itself to kind of create, if you look at the side, you can start to play around with the kind of size and shape of the source itself, which affects kind of the output as you go through. Similar to the last one, as you go through the Arnold, you can see that there are different exposure samples, shadow densities, and also in the initial settings, you can get light effects such as fog intensities and settings, which can definitely benefit your overall render. And so once you have those in mind, I'm just going to create an ambient occlusion rendering for Shea to work with. I got ahead of myself a little bit because of the fact that this wasn't working, but let's see if we can get it up, because there are some important things about the actual render view that you should consider. This icon here is the render settings. And so what this does is under the common tab, it will tell you the file output. And so if you go into the image format, you can set it as a PNG. And usually I send it to INT 16, the higher one. And if you go down, you can see that there are image size adjustments that you can make. Now, you probably know from before, but the resolution for print is typically 300 dpi, or pixels per inch, and then you can adjust kind of your width and your height that you want the render to be based on those there. 72 dpi, or its default, is typically good for screen resolution, but will come out super pixelated if you guys use that for your final renders. There are also some other really interesting ones under the Arnold renderer. The most interesting areas are kind of in the lower ones here, like the ray depth as well as environmental settings. So this probably won't be useful for Sunday, but for the future, you can actually click onto certain settings and create a physical sky shader, which will create kind of like a nice background that you can toggle with. Again, it's not really necessary, but it's definitely something that you could kind of use in order to create like AI fog or atmospheric effects in the back of your renders. And as well as some physical camera settings like motion blurs, where you can change the shutter angle, or you can create kind of like a little Gaussian effect in the final render. And also it does show some basic environmental light settings, and as well as textures. And so definitely go through these settings, and if you are interested in kind of creating a realistic render later on, definitely check out the environmental background and those settings there. My saving grace for this tutorial was actually if you select a certain area on the renderer and you click this icon here, which is just render region, it will reduce your render time, and you can kind of just focus on one spot and see how the material is kind of turning out in that one location, so you don't have to wait for an entire rendering to go through, which is awesome. And for Sunday, we'll just kind of go back to what we were talking about before. So we'll select the object, we'll go into hyperlink, we'll go into the ambient occlusion material, and right click and assign the material to the selection. And it should occlusion render. And so if we go up and we go into the render view area, and we just select a certain region and then create the render. We'll have our ambient occlusion render, which then, after we go through the settings and we set up our PNG and our file size, we can go in and we can save our image to our desktop or wherever it is that you want to keep it. And one of the things that Shay also asked me to kind of bring you guys to is if you did want to kind of prepare for a potential overlay, you can kind of follow the steps that we did last week, where you went in and you changed the material to like a black, and then you sent the back to a black material. But there is another way. If you do want a black wireframe, what you can do is you can go to assign new material, and then there's actually a use background option. And so if you go into this viewport here, you can go into the shading, wireframe on the shaded, and then if you want to change your wire color, you just go into the wireframe color settings that we talked about last week, RGB, and then we'll just keep it at black and apply. And so in the same way that we did before, I'm sure you guys are totally used to seeing this by now, but I'm just going to run through it in case some people used a different method. Going into the Play Blast options, you can kind of export your PNG. Is everyone familiar with that, or does anybody need me to kind of go through that aspect of it?
Does it matter that you have it at 0, 1, not 1 and 1?
No, when you had it at 1, 1, did you notice that it gave 2 outputs?
Yeah.
Yeah. 0, 1 just means it's one frame. 1 to 1 gave 2 outputs previously, but this is how you prevent that. It's just a little tweak. One other way, if you just want to kind of create the border, is let's put a material on this guy here, and if we go into take off the wireframe shading, we just have our material here. If you go into rendering in the top corner here, from modeling down to rendering, you'll see that the top toolbar has quite a few different tools that show up. Now there's one that's called Tune, which is very interesting because you can assign an outline to an object. So if you go down to assign outline, you can go to add to an outline, and what that will do is that will create an interactive object or interactive outline that you can kind of manipulate the, for example, the line width or the kind of the line effects in the object itself, which then you can export similar to the wireframe and use as an outlining device. And so for Sunday, that's really what you're going to need to know, just how to do a basic like ambient occlusion layer, and then potentially bring in line work in order to kind of accentuate certain areas. Okay, and Shay is going to come up now and tell you a little bit about post-production.